Okay, welcome everyone. As I think most of you just heard, this is being recorded. So it's being recorded. That's why the people who couldn't join us tonight, there's some people who I think register for these so that they can get the recording. So glad that our speakers have given us that permission. Welcome, and we're asking you all to please stay on mute. There's a lot of us on the call tonight, so we want to be sure that we can all hear the main speaker when they're speaking. Later on, there will be a chance for some questions and answers, especially for Dan Lenz from Law Forward. We're asking you to use the chat for that. So at that point, if you're going to have questions, if you can put them in the chat. So without any further ado, we're going to start with our opening reflection. Reverend Steve Hartman from Green Bay has graciously volunteered to lead us with an opening reflection.
Good evening. I'm a member of the Spiritual Leaders Caucus with the Joshua organization here in Green Bay. And I appreciate an opportunity to be with you in conversation. I'm perplexed by as many of you, I'm sure, perplexed by the kind of sharp divisions that are slicing through our community, locally as well as nationally. You know, frozen Congress, tear it all down and start over attitude that I see on interviews too many times. But I realize the context of this worldview is one of power and fear and domination of other people. That's a theme that continues to repeat again and again. But I found a little insight in researching how to resist white Christian nationalism. And that came from Robert Jones, who talking about the extreme right right wing of the Nationalist Party, said from that worldview, there really aren't political opponents. What there are is existential enemies. And then he continues, I think that's also kind of poison for the fabric of democracy in the country. So all of that is to say that in Green Bay, we're working on a proposal to start a conversation with a book read. Our board of directors asked if we might bring the clergy and religious leaders and spiritual leaders together to ask how we are faring in the midst of all of this, and also how might we challenge and build a different response from what we're seeing. So we're doing a book read on A More Perfect Union by Adam Russell Taylor. And it's a new vision for building the beloved community. And so I'd ask for your support and your prayers as we move into that conversation. And then I would ask, would you please just join with me for a word in prayer? God of all peoples, in all times and all places, we acknowledge deep divides and distress in our world and in your creation, a manipulation and misappropriation even of the Christian faith language and other faith communities as well. Turn our attention to the ways of love and justice and the things that make for peace. In today's conversation, we seek ways promoting reason, compassion, and radical acceptance and humane treatment of all peoples. Help us find wisdom and courage to seek the ways of justice, life-giving hope, and simple respect for all the children of the earth. In the name of the Spirit of gracious love, amen.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you all for being here. We've got a great turnout tonight, which I think is a tremendous testament to how much you all are paying attention to and care about our upcoming elections and our democracy in general. We planned tonight's main topic around, or actually the theme of tonight is our election, our upcoming April election, and what's on our ballot, and helping you all and all of us to understand what is on our ballot. And two things that are particularly of interest and concern to us that are hard to understand, are two constitutional amendments that we will be voting on. And so we asked Dan Lenz from Law Forward to join us tonight. Law Forward is an amazing nonprofit law firm that has been doing tremendous work around protecting our democracy for the last couple of years. And Dan has been tireless in his work to do so. I've been in many, many meetings with Dan. I've heard Dan speak. He spoke at my synagogue a few months ago. He has that rare quality for a lawyer, which is that not only does he have a deep knowledge of the law, but he's actually able to talk about it and explain it to non-lawyers in a way that we can actually understand. So we're really excited to have Dan with us. If you have questions, as Dan is speaking, we will have time for Q&A. And I ask you all, because there are a lot of us in the meeting tonight, to help us stay on time and help us stay on track, if you could put your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can, knowing that we also have 3 other speakers tonight. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Dan, because he is our main event.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. I'm so excited to be with all of you. And I want to thank, of course, not only all of you for being on the call, but some of the amazing partners to Law Forward that are represented here, particularly Rabbi Bonnie, who has been a partner of Law Forward, and Wisconsin Faith Voices has been a partner of Law Forward and a client, and has done such amazing work, and we're so proud to partner with them. And then same with Wisdom and David. Similarly, we've partnered and continue to work with that amazing organization. And David has been such an incredible resource and thought leader and client. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and we're thrilled to be doing that work in coalition with so many amazing people. And I know I see a number of familiar names, and I'm remiss, I'm sure, in not shouting out others, but I do want to certainly acknowledge what incredible talent and care and compassion there are represented in our state and on this call. So with that, I am here tonight to talk about mostly the 2 constitutional amendment questions that'll appear on our April ballot, and kind of how we got here. And it's largely a history lesson. We'll kind of walk through it together. I'm also going to at least touch on what are now 3 constitutional amendment questions that are scheduled to appear on the November ballot, and at least kind of mention those, though hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk more about those over the summer as we head into the November election season. So with that, and then of course, answer any questions I can about the amendments, about the questions on the ballot, or anything else that might be of interest. So with that, I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay, great. Hopefully everyone is seeing my slideshow. All right, so I want to start with a little bit of background before we get into the amendments themselves, just about how we have constitutional amendments in the state of Wisconsin, how that system works. Our Constitution, the Wisconsin Constitution, contains 2 methods to amend our Constitution, though we only ever really use one. And that is this one, which is a lot of text, but basically what it says is there's the method we use the most are legislatively proposed constitutional amendments. And the system we have, and this is the system we've had since 1847, is this. The legislature proposes amendments through resolutions. Those resolutions need to be voted on by both houses in 2 consecutive legislatures. So they get passed by the Assembly, voted on by the Senate. Then we have a general election, like the one we're going to have in November, where our legislature turns over. Then that legislature has to vote on the same amendment again through the Assembly and through the Senate. They only need to be passed by simple majorities. There's no supermajority requirement. They don't need to be passed by 2/3 of either house or anything like that. And they're not subject to veto by the governor. Once those amendments have passed through the legislature twice, or 2 consecutive legislatures, Then they're put on the statewide ballot for a referendum. And if they're approved by a majority of the voters who vote on that referendum, they become part of our Constitution. That's kind of automatic at that point. There's no veto opportunity at that point. And that's that. So that is how we have amended our Constitution over 100 times, I believe, in the past 150 years, 160 years. I will at least mention the other method by which we can amend our Constitution, and that the Constitutional Convention. Again, this is a legislative process. The majority of the Senate and the Assembly have to vote to call a Constitutional Convention. We have not had a Constitutional Convention since the 1840s, when we adopted our current Constitution. Wisconsin doesn't have any method by which citizens can propose or vote on amendments, and this puts us apart from states like Michigan or Minnesota. So, that's one of the reasons, for example, that we haven't had an anti-gerrymandering constitutional amendment, or other amendments that generally share broad support but don't have support in the legislature. We don't have a method right now by which citizens can start that process, which is unfortunate. The thing that's important about constitutional amendments, and the reason I think we're seeing a lot of them right now, is twofold. One is, as I mentioned, it's a way for the legislature to create law and policy that circumvents the governor. The governor has no role in this process. If they can get a majority of the folks to vote on it, then this will become law. The other reason is that it constrains the court. We've obviously had a significant change in our court in the past year, and there's been a lot of, I think, concern from the legislature as to what that means. If they pass constitutional amendments, those are binding on the court. The court's authority is based on our Constitution, and so it can't strike down constitutional amendments the same way it can strike down laws that violate the Constitution. And the other reason is that they're pretty permanent. To repeal an amendment, you have to go through the exact same process. You have to pass a repealing amendment through 2 separate legislatures, which takes, at a minimum, a number of years. And then it has to be approved by the voters. So that gets us to the amendments that we're going to talk about tonight. And we're going to start with question 1. There are 2 questions that are going to be on the ballot. One is about money and one is about people. And I'm going to start with the one about money. And understanding this proposed amendment requires, unfortunately, for all of us, going back to the early days of COVID and thinking about what that was like and what was going on at that point. As folks might remember, Wisconsin was one of the first states. It was in the midst of the 2020 presidential primary season, and Wisconsin was one of the first states to hold a statewide election during COVID. And that was our April 7th, 2020 spring election and primary. And I'm sure, many of us lived through this in different ways. I was involved in some litigation around this. I'm sure folks may have been poll workers. It was a very difficult and stressful time for voters, for elected officials, for election workers, for all of us. And that on top of kind of the personal trauma that we're all going through, as we were dealing with this new world. The April 7th, 2020 election, unfortunately, reflected a lot of that. There was a lot of litigation. There were attempts to postpone the election or move it. There were some tweaks to the rules. There was not a lot of input from the legislature and trying to help with this situation. And as a result, there were a number of issues. There were a lot of issues around absentee ballot delivery, as a lot of voters who had never voted by absentee ballot suddenly had to, right, for safety and for health reasons. And we shifted from what was almost entirely a polling place election day voting system to a considerable absentee process. There were long lines. This is, one of the pictures that always stands out to me from that election. At polling places, there were poll worker shortages and polling place consolidations. The governor ended up having to call in the National Guard to provide support to election officials. And there were a number of struggles with supplies. And this is how we voted in 2020, and it was difficult and scary for many. Here's Robin Voss making the best of it, I guess. And I believe at this time he was encouraging people how safe it was to vote in person. while dressed like this, which was a time. Other states, as they proceeded to have elections over the spring and summer, had similar issues, right? We're all dealing with many of the same things, a lot of the same supply shortages, and dealing with this new public health problem crisis. In response to all of this, a number of philanthropists started donating money to election officials and others to get ready for what was going to be the August in Wisconsin and then November everywhere 2020 elections. And this was going to be a presidential election. It was going to be a historic election. We all knew that turnout was going to be very, very high. And so folks started preparing for that election pretty shortly after April. One organization that led the effort to help election officials get ready for the presidential election was CTCL, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which at the time had been like an existing small organization, which I think had a budget of like maybe $1 million, $2 million, that worked with local election officials. They received a huge influx of cash, including $350 million from Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan. And this becomes an important part of our story. There's Mark Zuckerberg. There's another picture of Mark Zuckerberg that I prefer. And they donate a ton of money. And a lot of people are donating money around this time to help election officials. Approximately $10 million of the funds that were donated were used by over 100 municipalities and 38 of Wisconsin's 72 counties. A lot of municipalities, small municipalities, big municipalities, applied for and received money to help for the election. And they use that to cover the increased cost of administering an election during COVID, including getting supplies and personal health equipment. So here's some of the stuff that election officials use the CTCL money for. They used it to facilitate curbside voting, which became a much bigger deal during 2020 and subsequently. Personal protective equipment, things like gloves, masks, face shields, and then more election equipment, things like ballot tabulators. This one on the bottom right is the DS450, which can just process ballots a lot faster. That started to be used by central count municipalities that suddenly had a lot more absentee ballots. Other things they used it for: poll worker training, recruitment, hazard pay, renting additional polling places. A number of municipalities had to move polling locations or central counts to much bigger facilities to facilitate social distancing, temporary staffing support. They had to hire more people, nonpartisan voter education from cities and counties, lots of things. And like I said, every municipality that applied for this money received it. And that becomes important, though that fact often gets lost. These grants, the CTCL grants, specifically, were challenged in court before the November 2020 election. They were challenged in federal court in Milwaukee. I should say the Wisconsin ones were challenged. They were challenged, I think, in a number of places throughout the country in advance of the election. And the federal court threw it out and found that there's no violation of state or federal law. So the November 2020 election happens, as we all remember. And unfortunately, these grants become part of the big lie about the outcome of that election and the fact that Donald Trump had lost. Subsequent to this election, one of the central claims that election conspiracy theorists picked up on was that these grants were somehow part of an effort to turn the election against Trump and for President Biden. They become part of the central claim not only in the media narratives around it, but also in litigation. So here you can see a list of some, but not all, of the cases in Wisconsin that were brought in part or completely over these grants, some of which we were involved in, a number of which we weren't, some of which were filed almost immediately after the election, challenging the outcome. And one of the things they said is that the CTCL grants violated the law. They became particularly the cause of groups like the Thomas More Society and the Wisconsin Voter Alliance and other sort of extremist fringe election denying organizations and individuals. Unfortunately, they also became a central claim of Michael Gableman and his legislatively funded, quote unquote, investigation into the 2020 general election. Michael Gableman, in part because he was working with individuals from the Thomas More Society, becomes focused on this idea that the CTCL grants and Mr. Zuckerberg's money somehow was an unlawful interference in our election. And so you can see I just excerpted some parts of Mr. Gableman's report, chapters 1, 2, 4, all are about these grants. And then he makes a specific recommendation at the end of his report that the state consider prohibiting outside funding of our elections. His conclusions, what one reviewed, and in my opinion as well, are just not true. And he calls them election bribery. They're not election bribery. All of these were adjudicated through the courts, state, federal courts, Republican appointees, Democratic appointees, all throughout these claims, the idea that this was bribery or somehow against the law. And substantively, you know, whether or not they're illegal, the central claim that was made here that money somehow changed how our elections were run is simply not true. Election officials ran our elections in 2020, just like they do in every year. We have municipally run elections in the state, meaning we have 1,850 municipal clerks who in their municipality, whether it is the town of Blueberry or the city of Madison, run their elections. They use city staff. They have sworn poll workers. That's who runs our election. They use this money to facilitate those elections in what was a very difficult time in the midst of rapidly changing public health information. Nothing about these election grants or anything else we're going to talk about changed the rules around our elections. Those rules, to the extent that they were ever changed, were changed to the proper procedures through courts and Wisconsin Elections Commission, and our municipalities, you know, lawfully appointed individuals who decide these things and are democratically accountable. And no court found that any of this violated any state law or federal law. So this gets us all to the question that's going to appear on our ballot. Question 1 is part of a larger movement of states passing this type of funding ban after the 2020 election. So you can see here a map of some of the states that have passed these bans. It's, I think, about 23 states right now, mostly states with a Republican trifecta, have passed this type of ban. So here's what will actually appear. Question 1, use of private funds in election administration. Shall section 7, sub 1 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that private donations and grants may not be applied for, accepted, expended, or used in connection with the conduct of any primary election or referendum. Article 3 is the article of our Constitution that deals with suffrage, with our right to vote. Article 3 is what guarantees our right to vote. This will create a new section that will prohibit outside election funding with this language. Nothing, as you can kind of gather from the language on the screen, nothing about this provision and nothing about the text of the amendment requires an increase or sufficient funding in elections. And there's been no legislative action to say, hey, if this passes, we need to make sure we've increased our election funding. In fact, as we've seen with the debate around Act 12 over the last year, municipal funding is still kind of fundamentally broken in our state, and that includes funding that goes to election officials. Increased funding from Act 12, while certainly important, is certainly not a permanent solution to municipal budget shortfalls. City of Madison, where I live, is having budgetary problems. Cities will continue to have budgetary problems. Instead, reducing this source of funding will just force municipalities to do more with less, remove a tool that they currently have for running safe, efficient, legal elections in our state. Most recently, in the most recent budget, the legislature declined the governor's invitation to increase funding for WEC, our statewide Wisconsin Elections Commission. So we haven't seen, you know, it's not as though there's been a huge groundswell of funding to make up for the reduction in private grants. And that's important, even if one accepts the premise that we don't want large dollar donations in our election administration. If we think that that might be the cause of influence, though I don't think that happened in 2020, even if one accepts that, this amendment goes farther. It prohibits any grant or donation. And I can tell you as an attorney who's looked at this, as someone who's thought a little bit about this, there's all sorts of weird stuff that this could apply to. You know, think about the local baker who provides pastries for poll workers. That's a donation. That's a donation that's going to be used in the conduct of an election. Is that now going to be unlawful? The text of the amendment in the legislature isn't telling us. There's no bill for us to find out. There's nothing for the legislature to say, oh, this is what we mean. And even if there was, you know, we shouldn't just think about what the legislature means. You also have to think about how this can be weaponized or used by big lie guys, by election deniers, folks who have been since 2020 bringing mostly frivolous, mostly denied cases that interfere with our election administration. This will be another kind of tool in their toolbox to interfere with the good work that our clerks do, that WEC does, that county clerks do in running the election. So that is question 1. And I can talk a little bit about question 2. And question 2 is the people question. This background here is very similar, but it addresses a slightly different thread of the same conspiracy theory. As part of this 2020 philanthropic movement, this movement around getting supplies and hazard pay to election officials, various nonprofits came in and consulted with or offered to consult with municipalities around the state of Wisconsin around election administration. Some, but not all of these nonprofit groups were coordinated by CTCL, who is also coordinating the money, and that again becomes important. And similarly, this is all happening in the first 8 months of COVID and a seismic shift in how our elections were going to be run in 2020. This is a huge shift towards absentee balloting in ways that Wisconsin's never dealt with, changes in how polling places don't have to work. Consultants brought in some national expertise. You know, there are a lot of states that have had almost exclusive absentee balloting well before we did. And so they brought in that type of expertise and how you can properly run kind of a massive absentee balloting situation, how you can run polling places with social distancing, that kind of thing. Again, none of the consultants who came in had any power to change election law, to change the rules around how we run our elections. And as far as I know, none of them did. But nonetheless, again, as part of the outcome of the 2020 election, these folks start receiving outside right-wing media attention. So here's just a few stories about consultants, about, you know, specifically Green Bay and Milwaukee became the focus of a lot of attention based on their consulting with a group called the National Vote at Home Institute. And similarly, again, your friend and mine, Michael Gableman, becomes very involved in this. Sorry about this odd note. And makes it, again, a focus of his report. And specifically, he ties the Zuckerberg donation and the CTCL money to this idea that consultants were coming in from out of town and controlling our elections. So that gets us all to now question 2, election officials. Shall Section 7, Sub 2 of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to provide that only election officials designated by law may perform tasks in the conduct of primary elections and referendum. I should say, you know, as background to this, so this is what I think they're getting at, is they don't want this type of consultant relationship where folks can come in and try to help city clerks, you know, run their operation in an efficient and safe way. I think that's what this amendment is geared towards. I should say, just so folks know, we have a lot of rules about how our election officials conduct elections. So again, just kind of to show you an example, here's the law about the duties of the municipal clerks. And this doesn't include the administrative code. This doesn't include all the things that are in the election administration handbook or the election day handbook. This is just the statutes about municipal clerks who are sworn election officials in our state. We carefully, and sometimes I think unfairly, tie the hands of our elections officials under the law. And you know, I think there are a lot of reasonable debates around that and how we want our elections to run and how much leeway we give our election officials. But as things stand, there are a lot of laws that deal with what our election officials do, and they follow those, I think, to the best of their ability in almost all circumstances. Here's another example. This is the law around the local boards of canvass, the folks who count the ballots on election day at the polling places, the local board of canvass. Again, it's not as though we are conducting our elections secretly or, you know, in locked rooms with, you know, smoke-filled rooms. We have a lot of laws. We regulate these things carefully. And that's, you know, the way our system works, and nothing about what happened in 2020 changed any of that. These laws were all followed. And, you know, to the extent that they weren't, we have procedures, agency procedures, lawsuits to make sure that they are. Oh, I'm gonna get back to that one in a sec. Okay, so so that's question 2. So question 2 presents this idea that election officials should perform our election duties. To be clear, I'm not really sure what, if anything, will change under the law. All those statutes that I showed you and the many, many other statutes from chapters 5 through 10 and 12 of our election code, or of our statutes, will continue to apply. That work is currently done by sworn election officials. It will continue to be done by sworn election officials. I don't think any of that will change. But once again, we'll have this type of weird ambiguity where we'll have this language in our Constitution that can be used. You know, if folks don't like some practice or procedure, I think that they'll try to use it to create problems. To give you some examples, there are a lot of groups, I'm sure folks here have done it, who volunteer around elections. They do things like, you know, drive folks to the polls or help the city clerk track down folks who haven't returned their absentee ballot. It's unclear what will happen to that type of volunteer effort. You know, I don't think it should be covered by any of this because that's not the conduct of an election. And I think we'd be happy to work on that, but it's unclear right now, A, whether that could be challenged, and B, whether there will just be municipal clerks who don't want to deal with it, right? They don't want to deal with the threat of litigation. They don't want to deal with the threat of folks coming in and saying they're doing it wrong, and will just not permit that type of, you know, super important and super helpful volunteerism that make our elections run well, and make sure that the franchise is extended to everyone who's eligible to vote. Right. I'm gonna get back. There's one other thing I should talk about here, and it's something that we don't always talk about, but I think is important, and particularly for I want to bring up with this audience. We don't know what's in anyone's heart. We don't know, you know, I'm not part of the legislative discussions about why these are passed, but it is striking that all of this is done. You know, I showed you what Gableman said, that we talk about Zuckerberg and we talk about him specifically. And every time that we're talking about the idea that there are Jewish billionaires who have outsized influence in our elections, you know, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and it is nothing new. It is nothing we haven't seen before, but it is part of a troubling trend that continues to this day. And so I throw this up here just kind of show you how I think about it, at least sometimes, that this is part of sort of an unbroken line, this idea that there are unseen, all-powerful forces that are controlling our elections or controlling the world. Again, I'm not pointing my finger to any particular individual, but when you hear terms like Zuckerbucks, or this is Zuckerberg money, or you know, the Soros-controlled prosecutors in Georgia or New York or whatever, you know, these are all sort of part of a theme. And it's something I think we should all be aware of and careful about. So with that, because I think I'm pretty close to my time, there are also 3 other questions that are going to come up in the November 2024 election, some of which just got on the ballot a couple weeks ago. They were passed through the second consideration of the legislature. So I've put them up on the screen, one of which is eligibility to vote, which changes the language of Article 3 from its current inclusive language that every U.S. citizen 18 years and older who's a resident of their district for 28 days is eligible to vote, to exclusive language. Only U.S. citizens who are 18 years and older, blah, 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 are eligible to vote. This is part of, again, a movement to try to restrict voting. It would try to restrict the ability of a municipality to, you know, offer non-citizen voting for something like a school board election, where folks who are not U.S. citizens may certainly have equities in how their school board is run, may want to vote in that election. Right now, It's not clear whether a municipality could do that. This, I think, is aimed towards making sure that a municipality couldn't do that. It doesn't change eligibility for voting for any other type of election, you know, presidential elections, that type of thing. So in some ways it is, I think, you know, potentially a turnout mechanism or a red meat issue, which is very unfortunate. But it does remove some of that flexibility for things like very localized municipal elections. The other two questions are connected. One is the delegation of the appropriation power. I won't spend a lot on this one because it's pretty dry, but the idea that the legislature could no longer delegate the spending authority. That may sound like it's the legislature trying to restrict their own power. They're not. They're trying to restrict the power of state agencies to make certain spending funds, some of which is currently being litigated before the court. The idea that state agencies would no longer have that type of authority. And then the third one, again, is it kind of comes out of COVID. Right now, the governor has a lot of authority to spend federal money when it comes into the state. This would move that authority to the legislature to be approved. And you know, the legislature has historically, especially in the last couple of years, really used their authority to stop the governor from spending and enacting certain policies. Kind of wrapping up, the legislature has sort of taken power for itself in every opportunity. And Steve was mentioning this as part of his opening remarks, this idea that they're taking power as opposed to sharing power. Particularly the November 2024 amendments do that again. We see the legislature continuing to try to take power for itself. And the last thing I'll say about these, because they're all kind of dire or unfortunate, and can cause anxiety, and I think are really a problem. Ultimately, the check on all of these things is the power of the people and the power of the people to vote no on these referenda. The one saving grace we have in this otherwise legislatively controlled process is that to get any of this stuff through, they have to have the consent of the people. And while these are sometimes dressed up as pretty anodyne amendments, they sound good on paper. No one really knows what they're about. I do hope people will take some time, think about it, think about why they're on the ballot, think about the effects that they might have down the road, and make an informed decision. So with that, put my information up on the screen and I'll stop sharing and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. This was really helpful, really clear, and really appreciate the greater context. So we're starting to get some questions in the chat. A question I think about the second referendum, would this exempt volunteer poll workers? So if it bans any but election officials, does that mean there can no longer be volunteer poll workers?
That's a great question. I think it's getting to the idea that poll workers can sometimes work without pay. It's usually an option, or at least when I've done it, you have the option to work for or without pay. It wouldn't affect that because poll workers are still individuals who are identified by law as performing certain election functions under Chapter 7 of our statutes. So they are sort of a legally recognized group of election officials, whether or not they're being paid for their work. So, you're under the supervision of the clerk and the chief inspector in your polling place or whoever's supervising. It shouldn't stop municipalities from using that type of poll worker.
Great, thank you. As a church or any religious institution or nonprofit, I'm going to add to the question, do we have any legal problems if we publicize information about the constitutional amendments to our congregation? We must remain nonpartisan. Can we use the information shared by the League of Women Voters?
I am not an expert on 501c3 compliance or the compliance that faith organizations have to follow. I will say that the League of Women Voters is a 501c3 and is very careful about that. So the information that they share is not generally, is 501c3 compliant. And I might stop there. I'm happy if someone wants to talk more about that, please do send me an email. We can touch base tomorrow. I don't want to give anyone bad information on a call.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, we do trainings all the time about 501c3 do's and don'ts. And congregations and other 501c3 nonprofits have to stay nonpartisan, as the question said, which means you cannot advocate for or against a candidate or for or against a political party. You can engage in legislative lobbying and talk about referenda on the ballot, as long as you keep to what the IRS calls an insubstantial part of your budget. The IRS has never defined what insubstantial is. So generally speaking, as long as your expenditures on behalf of whatever efforts you're doing around legislation or referendum stays, what legal scholars who are experts in 501c3 have told me is stay under 5% of your budget. And if you think about all the many things that your congregation does and how much time you might spend on lifting up the constitutional amendments, maybe sharing the video from tonight's event or sharing League of Women Voters postings, how much time that might be spent on that, it's not going to be 5% of your budget. And I say that I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice. So somebody asked, poll workers were paid double during COVID. I believe this was federal money, so would these raises go away?
Yeah, so that was done, I believe, municipality by municipality, and I think Rose is absolutely correct. That was mostly federal money. Federal money wouldn't be implicated because that is not private money. You know, it's still public money, and the state receives federal money for all sorts of things. However, I don't know if I don't know the status of those raises. I think it depends on the municipality and what their funding situation is. Obviously, a lot of money that was in place during kind of the early years of COVID has gone away in a lot of different ways. And also there's been substantial inflation since then as well. So where poll worker pay will be heading into August and November, I don't know. But the amendment, I don't think would be the controlling factor in any of that. Well, except I should say that the ability of municipalities to apply for and receive private funding to, say, make up for a lack of federal funding would go away. And so they may have to make tough budgetary decisions on that basis.
Great. Does the delegation of appropriation power mean that the legislature will have the power to micromanage agency budgets? For example, no budgetary discretion for spending on things like climate change or other red meat issues. Having trouble getting my thing to scroll. Like diversity, equity, inclusion.
To a certain extent, I think yes. I think that's the idea, is that it keeps budgetary and spending control in the legislature. So instead of the legislature saying we are going to provide, call it, you know, $500 million to DNR to run certain stewardship programs, and then DNR will determine how they're going to actually spend that money, those decisions would have to be made by the legislature. I don't know if they'd be done through committees or what, but that type of budgetary delegation would no longer be, at least under my read of the amendment, possible.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Dan. If you wouldn't mind putting your email in the chat, I know it was in the slide, but if you could put it in the chat, that would be really great. Thank you. This was really wonderful, really helpful. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over now to David Liners to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you very much, Dan, for this and for the incredible work that Law Forward does, and we all benefit by it a lot. Our next speaker is going to be Ms. Peggy West-Schroder. Peggy is the executive director of the FREE organization, which we're proud to have as part of our Wisdom Network. FREE is an organization of, by, and for women who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. Really pleased that Peggy could join us tonight, especially since she's actually over in Madison getting ready for a major women's history related event that FREE is doing at the Capitol tomorrow. So if you're free, not if you're a member of FREE, but if you want to join FREE and you're free tomorrow, if you're in Madison, I'm sure Peggy can tell you about it. So Peggy is going to run us through about 10 or 15 minutes of what else are you going to find on your ballot when you go to vote in April. So Peggy, thanks for being here, and you can take it away.
I couldn't unmute myself there for a minute. All right, here we go. I am using Canva to present my slides, so I cannot see the chat. So, if you have a question, you can either just blurt it out, or you can, save it, and I promise I will answer all the questions at the end. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about, starting off, a little bit about the election process. So I heard a lot of talk in the previous with the previous speaker about nonpartisan or bipartisan. So you've got partisan, nonpartisan, or bipartisan. Most of the elections that happen in the spring are going to be nonpartisan, meaning your mayor, your school board, your county board, your alder people, those are all nonpartisan, meaning that they don't have to tell you, and they're not running on a ticket saying I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a member of the Green Party. So this talks a little bit about the ballot requirements. And one of the most important things that any candidate has to do, including incumbents, is that they have to circulate nomination papers. And in those nomination papers, they have to let you know what office they're running for, what city, what county they're running in. And you, as a person signing those papers, has to be able to vote. And you have to live sometimes within the district of the person that's passing, that's asking you to sign their papers. So say your alderman can't go to the other side of the city and get people to sign their nomination papers. They have to be from your aldermanic district. Now, where this gets interesting for those of you who are into politics as sport is when you have incumbents who are so good at getting people who run against them knocked off the ballot based on their signatures. And we actually in Milwaukee see quite a bit of that. So if you got knocked off the ballot, you could still run as a write-in candidate. So you may see some write-in, or you may get contacted and have somebody ask you to write them in. There's actually one person I can remember, and that was County Board Supervisor Theodore Lipscomb. He ran as a write-in candidate and actually won some years ago. So these are your 2024 elections, and I'm gonna throw a little advice out there. If you're not following Wisdom or Wisdom Action on social media, you should be. Because Amanda does a great job of keeping you up to date on what's going on with the elections. So by April 2nd is the presidential preference primary. And February 20th was the spring primary, which means April 2nd is also the spring general election. So what primaries do is they whittle the candidates down to 2 candidates. Again, if it's a bipartisan race, it's just the top 2 vote getters. If it is a partisan race, then you end up with 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and maybe 1 independent. And they run for that seat, and whoever gets the most votes wins. I also included the fall elections just because. So August 13th is the fall primary, and then November 5th, we all know, is the fall general election. All right, so spring, here's who you're going to see on your ballot. We have the Court of Appeals, District 1, and the Circuit Court Judge for municipal branches. So circuit court judges, they hold a 6-year term. The county executive is also on the ballot. That's a 4-year term. County board supervisor is a 2-year term. The county comptroller is a 4-year term. And the county treasurer is a 4-year term. And municipal court is also a 4-year term. So that's who you've got on your ballot in the spring in Wisconsin this year. In fall, we've got our state senators, which is 4 years, and we're all looking forward to this, right? Because now we got new maps and we're chomping at the bit to get out there and see what happens in these districts that are highly contested right now. So state senators have 4-year terms. State representatives have 2-year terms. Your district attorney has a 4-year term. And then, of course, there's the mayor, which is 4-year term, your city attorney, which is a 4-year term, your comptroller is a 4-year term, and the common council is 4-year terms. So I wanted to point this out to you. Who else are you electing? So when these people come to your door and knock and say, hey, hi, how are you doing? You also have to think about how you would consider this person to be as a leader for the body that they're running for. Because once these individuals get elected, your common council person, your county board supervisor, your school board member, they're then going to take a vote. Someone's going to become the president of the common council. Someone's going to become the vice president. And you want to think about how you feel about these people, again, not just as your elected official, but as a leader of those bodies. And I am a constituent of President Jose Perez in Milwaukee. So again, county boards, state senators, state representative, common councils, they each have separate elections, usually on the swearing in day, to choose their leadership. Leadership also pick who gets what committee, which also can either impede or give you a great opportunity to get things done. So just kind of think about that.
If I could interrupt you for just a half a second, if you go back to that last slide.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
Just to be sure it's clear, all of those in yellow are on the spring ballot, even mayor, city attorney, common council, they're on the fall side, but they're all spring elections.
There you go.
Just wanted to make that clear.
Yes. All right. Going forward. So this is just a really brief, and maybe some of you don't need this and maybe you do. And when I did this presentation, I did it so that, whether you were brand new starting off or whether you were a seasoned novice, hopefully you learned something from this. So what do they do? And so this is just a brief glossary, and I will make sure that David has this presentation so he can send this out to you. It just basically describes what each one of these positions does, because that's one of the most popular questions that we get when we're out registering people to vote and asking people to get to the polls is like, well, why would I vote for my state representative? I don't even know what that person does or what they're supposed to do. And so you should, feel confident in what it is that they do, so that when you reach out to them, you're reaching out to the right person. We had a great discussion about this the other day, how you, when you are building your power map, how you have to make sure that you have the right target. And knowing what your representatives do is a great way to be able to do that. All right. Why vote in state elections? The number one is, if you don't vote, you can't complain. And we all like to complain, so we want to vote. The other piece of that is money, right? So as you're voting in state elections, as you tie this to the census, the people that have the districts that have the most people get the most representation, which ends up being also tied to how much funding goes into that district. Now, everybody in Milwaukee knows that the metrics that they use to try to fund Milwaukee is quite skewed, but everywhere else in the state that has a big population, they do quite well. So that's one of them. That's one of the other reasons that you want to vote, is to make sure that your community has access to those funds. The next reason is because when you call your state senator or when you call your elected official, period, they literally have a database in their office where they're able to look to see whether or not you vote. How often do you vote? And they know how serious they need to take your phone call. So if you vote and you're an avid voter and you call the mayor's office is going to call you back, and they're going to say, what what can I do for you? Because they know that you are a voter. The other reason that you want to vote is because you should have a say in who elects you, which is one of the reasons why Wisdom and Free want for people who are on probation and parole to be able to vote in the state of Wisconsin, is because our country was founded on no taxation without representation, yet that happens to about 45,000 people in the state of Wisconsin every day. So we want to make sure that those people who can vote do vote. All right. And this is just a quick, are you registered to vote? One of the things I do want to caution people about, there's especially ties in very well to the last speaker. There are a lot of things being done to keep people from their votes. One of them is called purging the voting lists. And so even if you are an avid voter, you should still go into myvote.wi.gov, put in your address, and make sure that you are still registered as a voter, so that you know that your name is secure on the list. I don't know if this has happened. It happened to me. I went to go vote and they said, oh no, your name's not on the voting roster. And I was just like, well, that's really crazy because I voted every year since I turned 18, so it should still be there. But it wasn't. And so I had to re-register to vote. And I'm sure if it was somebody else, they may have said, oh, okay, well, I'm just gonna go home then. But I obviously didn't. And that's it. This is my contact information. I will drop my email in the chat, and I am open to answer questions if you have any. Otherwise, you can always email me questions at any point, and I'm very happy to answer them for you.
Just real quick, if anybody in Madison wants to find you guys at the Capitol, what time should they go there tomorrow?
Oh, so tomorrow, registration is going to start at 9 a.m. and we'll be in Gar Hall, which is room 413 North. And we'll be here until 3 o'clock. We're going to start our legislative visits at 11 o'clock. And we actually got into some very interesting elected officials' offices this year. I don't know if that's because of all the gerrymandering being ended or if they just try to be nice, but it's kind of exciting. So I hope that some of you guys can make it. Please repeat the site to check if you're still registered. Okay, I'm going to drop that in the chat too. It's myvote.wisconsin.gov. And if you've never checked out this website, you should check it out because it's got an amazing amount of information on it. You can literally find everything you need to know about voting here. And if you've never put in your address to see who your elected officials are, this will blow your mind. It's like 2 pages of people that you probably didn't realize you even elected. And so, go to myvote.wisconsin.gov, put your address in, check and see who your elected officials are. It literally tells you everybody. It's a good time. I'm kind of a nerd, but I still think
Find
it's a
out
good
your
time.
polling. You can
Yes,
find
your
out your
polling
polling
place,
place.
right.
You can get a preview of your ballot. There's all kinds of things there. If you do an
All kinds of good
absentee
stuff.
ballot, you can see if it's been received yet. There's a million things you can do on that.
And the most important is you can register to vote there. So if you know people who are not registered to vote, who need to be registered, they can register themselves at myvote.wisconsin.gov, or you could help them to register to vote at that site.
Can I comment that a lot of times as an election official, we have people that think they've registered, but they did not complete the process. And so it's always a good idea to print out that application for registration and read the instructions very carefully because that's a frequent occurrence.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, for that, and good luck with your event tomorrow.
Thank
And
you.
these spring elections are really important. To answer somebody's questions in there, these nonpartisan elections used to be, in many places, really very much nonpartisan. School board elections weren't fought on ideological lines. Nowadays, it's one of the reasons we started doing these events, was because a lot of these local elections have become very partisan, very divided. So it's just important to be paying attention. And it's too bad. It used to kind of be that, at least in smaller communities, just good government and just trying to make the schools run right was kind of what people were looking for. And increasingly, things have gotten ideological.
David, I have a quick question. For a while, we were not allowed to help people register to vote. And I think that's been given back to us now, but I'm not positive.
Well, you can
No,
help
it
someone,
hasn't.
but they have to kind of do it themselves. So it's mostly it's online now. So you can help somebody do it online. Actually, our canvassers do that. They'll have a tablet and actually hand it to the person and help them go through the process. But it's not like the old days where you can have a clipboard and fill out the information and just have people sign it.
The
They
problem
actually have
is
to kind of
some of the
put in
people
their own.
that we deal with in the inner city don't know how to do the tablet.
Mm,
Exactly. Well, it's why, again, someone can help them with it. Someone can actually stand there with them. I
right.
hate to do this, but in the interest of time, we do have another speaker yet, with yet more interesting things. As you may know, spring elections are incredibly important for public schools. This is when we elect the people who run our schools. There's a lot of school referenda and things like that. Luckily, we have an incredible, wonderful, effective grassroots organization in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Public Education Network, who really do great work on reaching out to parents, to educators, to citizens in every community around our state, to help people understand what's going on with the public schools and to understand what's at stake and to help learn how they can be supportive of keeping our public schools strong. And we have one of their organizers with us tonight, Christian Phelps, and he's going to talk to us about what's at stake for schools this spring.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for inviting me to do so. I recognize some of the names on the call now, but most I don't. So it's nice to meet some new people here. And my name is Christian. I work with Wisconsin Public Education Network and have for the last almost 4 years. I live in Eau Claire, but we support people across the state. And as David just said, public schools and the students that attend public schools are in many ways the people most directly affected by spring elections in Wisconsin. And so there are two major things on the ballot that directly relate to public schools. One is school board elections. Every now and then your local school district is on sort of a gap year, but most of the time you can rely on the fact that the April election in Wisconsin, you do have a local school board race on your ballot. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition, just like most or all of the people represented here. And so we do not have a horse in those races. We do not endorse candidates, but we do hope that everybody will understand what's at stake for public schools and students and be able to ask really good questions of the candidates running in their local districts. Back in the fall, we were helping public school champions of any political stripe, consider running for school board if they wanted to make that their contribution for kids in the local community. And so that's one of the things that's on your election in the April 2nd, or on the April 2nd ballot. Most of you may have noticed that in recent years, and this was just alluded to, we've seen kind of a new trend in school board elections. It often used to be difficult to even recruit people to run. There would be times where there'd be a vacant seat or a lot of unopposed races. And then the last, I'd say 3 cycles, it's become more common that partisan or quasi-partisan and certainly outside special interest groups sort of run what they call slates of candidates for school board who basically like make it so if there are 2 seats open, there are 4 candidates. If there are 3 seats open, there are 6 candidates. And they have kind of a clear ideological split. We've seen organizations like Moms for Liberty and the 1776 Project, which is named as sort of a backlash against the 1619 Project, endorse or financially support candidates, and same with the 2 major political parties, in an effort to sort of make these local elections into a situation where they are not, you know, a mom or dad from down the street who want to spend some time in their evenings making a difference, but rather kind of a vessel for a political pet project. Now, the interesting thing is that this year, Wisconsin is a large state. There are 421 school districts in our state. And so I can't speak with a blanket judgment on all of these races, but I will say that 2024, you know, the intel that we have gotten from our friends and network partners around the state is that these school board races have actually quieted down significantly. And on one hand, that is because people are, by and large, in rural, suburban, and urban Wisconsin, very turned off by the notion that outside interests or money or partisan politics would have entered their local school board race. And overall, that is extremely off-putting. And voters do not like the idea that their school board would become a political tool, certainly for outside groups to use, because ultimately all that happens is that it affects local kids and their educators. On the other hand, it also makes it trickier to tell whether that sort of problem I just outlined is happening. And so what I'm saying is that on one hand, it's quieted down because there is not an appetite for political extremism in a school board election. On the other, it has quieted down because people who wish to impose political extremism into a school board election may be finding that it is difficult to do so overtly. So one of the things that people have been wanting the most, and one of the ways that I think all of you and all of us could help in local communities, is to sort of just make sure that in a neutral, nonpartisan, and sort of pro-student way, you are ensuring that the candidates on your ballot for school board are answering questions to sort of show why they're running for school board. And this is, again, not something done in a way to endorse a candidate, rather to make sure that voters are aware of what's on their ballot. And so we are always happy to help teams or individuals get out the vote, educate voters, and part of educating voters is doing something like putting out a candidate questionnaire or forum in a way that, again, is not biased or slanted, but sort of asks the important yes or no questions on some of the issues that can be kind of politically charged, like book banning or privatization. So school board is a big one. It is not the one that we have been hearing the most about in 2024 so far. The biggest one is, and this graphic is actually already out of date, that number is now 91. School districts have referenda for funding on the local ballot just this spring. So like I said, 421 school districts in the state of Wisconsin, 91 of them just this spring have a referendum on their ballot. The reason is state funding for public schools is wildly broken and absolutely not meeting the needs of students. And if you are unaware whether your school district has a referendum on its ballot, it's time to reach out to the business managers and superintendents or sort of PTAs or teachers unions in your local area and find out. Because there's a lot of education to do for voters about why that's happening. And these are big get out the vote elections because by and large, people really support their local public schools. They want the best for the students and educators that bring those schools to life, but they need to know whether there's something they can do at the ballot box to make that a reality. Why does this matter to kids in your local area? Well, public schools are the heart of your community. They are the only schools that are required to impose a non-discrimination, non-ideological, excellent, robust, nurturing public education to every child in your community. No questions asked, no exceptions. And so we need to protect, strengthen, and improve that institution. And the ballot box in April is a big way to make sure you're playing a part in that. We got here because the state has passed budget after budget after budget since 2009 that for almost now 15 going on 16 years in a row have defunded public schools relative to inflation. As you can see, public schools are right now $3,380 per pupil behind the rate of inflation since 2009. And that's not to say things were great in 2009, but a forward analytics report from the fall of last year found that about 100 of our school districts, about a quarter of our school districts in Wisconsin, are relying on local referendum funds for at least 10% of their operating budget right now because the state just isn't coming through. And instead, it has prioritized privatization schemes where the funds come right off the top of your local school district to fund private schools that aren't held to the same transparency, accountability, or non-discrimination standards, and public schools pay the price for that. This is something that a lot of voters don't know because we've heard a lot of narratives from the legislature, which passed the budget, the governor who signed the budget, that we saw a historic investment in education. And while it was historic in the last budget for private schools, it is historically bad for public schools. A couple of notes from the Wisconsin Association of School Business Officials. The voucher expansion program is a big part of what's going on and why so many referenda are on the ballot right now. What started as a pilot in the 90s and was limited to only the school district of Milwaukee in 2009 is now taking funds from 82% of the school districts in the state of Wisconsin. And in addition to that, like I said, the state has just fallen behind dramatically on its funding of public schools. And that's in the midst of inflation and a pandemic and rising mental health needs. So while student need has gone up and the cost of educating and nurturing every child has gone up, state funding has gone down. So these are important things for voters to know. We've seen big changes in the approval rates of school referenda, and I think a lot of that has to do with things like exhaustion, getting out to vote, understanding what's on your ballot, and understanding the statewide narrative. So it's very important that everybody who cares about students in public schools be able to explain the importance of these ballot measures to voters. It's also something that can bring new voters to the polls. I mean, people generally don't like to think of themselves as political people because we've all got stuff going on. We are moral people. We care about our community. It's difficult to get involved in politics for the first time. But if it comes to funding the schools down the street and the students who attend them, that's really something that can bring voters to the polls. Here's sort of the daunting list of, again, just spring referenda. Those school districts in red on this list had a referendum on the ballot in February. The rest are going to have a referendum on their ballot in April. If you're like me, like I said, I live in Eau Claire, we're going to have a referendum in November. So this is an incomplete list. I think we're looking at probably a third of every school district in Wisconsin having a referendum on its ballot this year. And these are the kinds of things that keep your school's lights on and operations going. In some cases, it could mean whether your school district survives. So these are really important elections, and it's very important that people vote in them. We're here to help. We have a website, wisconsonnetwork.org. We have an election HQ and referenda support on there. Like I said, we're nonpartisan. We are like actually nonpartisan. We're belligerently nonpartisan. We do not want to get involved in partisan politics. Even if it were allowed, we wouldn't do it. But we do want to educate every single voter in every single community about what's at stake and help the people who really can tell the local story, which isn't us. It's all of you, and it's all the, the parents and educators and retired educators in your community. Reach voters and explain what's at stake at the ballot box, and then get them to the polls on election day or beforehand. So we have educational resources. We have get out the vote resources. We help referendum teams with some of the things that might be difficult in clearing the hurdles and getting their campaigns run, like, reaching voters, tools for digital organizing and texting and messaging support and things like that. We're always happy to help. So please reach out to us if you haven't already, if that's you, or if you are wondering if there's people in your community that you should be in touch with to help them do that. We're always happy to put you in touch with those folks and answer your questions, because the more voters get to the polls understanding what's at stake for students in public schools in the April election, the better it'll be for kids, and the better position we'll be in 2025 to sort of fix the wrongdoings of our state over the last 15 years or so and actually put the state on a better path for funding public schools and supporting students. And I have no idea whether I went over the amount of time I was given here, but I'm happy to answer questions either verbally or in the chat, whatever works best for the agenda, and help out with any confusions or concerns anybody has.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christian. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if people want to put something in the chat. Christian, would you mind, I know you put contact information in the slide, but would you mind putting your email in the chat? That would be really helpful.
Yeah,
So people can
absolutely.
follow up. And I also just want to make sure everybody is really clear, even though school board elections and judgeships and things like that are technically nonpartisan in that the candidates do not declare a party. They are still elections. Those are still candidates. And as 501c3 organizations, we still cannot endorse or oppose any particular candidate. So as Christian said, definitely raise awareness, definitely find opportunities to ask the candidates questions and to give your folks good questions to ask so that they know how to ask questions and what kinds of things to ask. But if you are speaking on behalf of your congregation or organization, you cannot endorse or oppose a particular candidate. So I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda Lindner. Rhonda is the interfaith organizer for the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, which is a project jointly of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice and the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And Rhonda is going to give us our call to action.
Thanks, Bonnie. So first of all, thanks to all the speakers. Christian, thank you for all the work you do. I was a public school teacher for 27 years in Illinois, and we had a lot of funding problems and gaps in Illinois as well. So thank you so much for the work you do for public school students and staff. Thanks to all of our speakers. However, some of my call to action was already, a couple of you stole my thunder because you're such active people, and so many of these names and faces I recognize and I've talked to, and I'm glad to call you all partners and friends. I would say that our call to action from WIVIC is 3 things. First, please check your voter registration at myvote.wi.gov. Please send that email, send that website. Sorry, it's a little late for me. Send the website, please, to at least 5 of your friends. Text them and ask them to check their voter registration status, and then have them forward that to 5 of their friends. This is totally nonpartisan. It's just checking voter registration. We call these texter trees. We don't check or anything, but it's so important to continue to spread this fantastic resource. You never know who doesn't have it, who didn't know about it, and who maybe has moved and forgot to check their voter registration status. WIVIC is focusing a lot on young and new voters. We have an event in Whitefish Bay tomorrow to educate young voters. We were in Madison last week. So please reach out to family and friends, especially if these are young voters, get them the information that they need so that they can register to vote. And as always, please keep WIVIC in mind. I'll try to put the my email in the chat. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me for any information you'd like into how to engage your fellow congregants and other networks to enhance voter registration, voter education, and voter protection for everyone here in Wisconsin. Thanks to all the organizers of this fabulous webinar today. I really appreciate being here. Yes, and thank you for that.
March 7th. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Thank you. So those of you living in Milwaukee or perhaps outside of Milwaukee, there is an event that we are calling 100 Women on the Move. And we are kicking it off with a luncheon on this Thursday, March 7th And it's a kickoff. Please come enjoy lunch and enjoy speakers. I'll be there, as well as Brenda Jackson. Thank you. I think you're on the chat. In the chat, Brenda Jackson from Micah and Anita Johnson from Souls to the Polls. We're going to be sharing ideas of how we can be on the move and help register as many voters as possible and educate voters and continue and help make Wisconsin a state with just tremendous voting rates. And thank you to Brenda for reminding me of that. I will put that information in the chat, and you can reach out to me, Rhonda, for any of this information. But if you are in Milwaukee or nearby, we'd love to see you March 7th, and we will keep everyone posted as well.
Thank you, Rhonda. To conclude tonight, I'm going to call on my friend Mary Straight. Mary is an amazing organizer. She's been a longtime volunteer with Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. She organized our sacred site visits for 2 years, and now she's helping to organize our interfaith intersections. She's an active member of Christ Presbyterian Church and heads up their refuge team, which works on immigration rights. And really pleased. Oh, and Mary just came back from a civil rights tour in Montgomery and Selma. So we're really thrilled, Mary, that you came home in time to be with us today and to offer our closing prayer.
Thank you. Please pray with me. We come together to lift up our leaders and our upcoming elections. We seek to better understand the concerns that confront our state and country and world, and how our faith traditions compel us to respond as faithful citizens. Thank you for what we've learned from our speakers tonight. We pray for discernment so that we may choose leaders that support unity, justice, truth, and love. Lead us in defending the vulnerable and voiceless, and bring justice to those who have suffered injustice. Guide us in our work for justice. Amen.
And thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Our last word is please go vote. And we'll see you soon. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you
night.
very much.
Right, thank you.